2014, a former soldier took his teenage daughter deep into the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend camping trip. The goal was simple: get away from the noise of everyday life and spend some quality time together. But what happened in those woods would scar them both for life, because in the middle of the night something began circling their camp, and it wasn't human. Marcus Chen was a man who believed that problems could be solved through discipline and planning. After 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger, he'd returned home to his wife Sarah and 16-year-old daughter Emma, hoping to transition back into civilian family life. But Emma had grown distant during his deployments, and despite being home for over a year, Marcus felt like he barely knew his own daughter anymore. Sarah suggested that Marcus and Emma take a camping trip together, just the 2 of them. She'd stay home to catch up on work, and maybe some uninterrupted father-daughter time in the wilderness would help them reconnect. Marcus thought it was a brilliant idea. He'd always felt more comfortable in the outdoors anyway, and surely a few days away from distractions would give them the space they needed to bond. Marcus chose a remote spot in the Monongahela National Forest near the Appalachian Mountains that he'd discovered during his own teenage years, a small clearing about 8 miles from the nearest trail marker, surrounded by towering hemlocks and ancient oaks, the kind of place where you could disappear from the world entirely. He packed with military precision, heavy-duty tent, water purification system, enough MREs and camping food for a week, comprehensive first aid kit, 2-way radios, and his trusted combat knife. Emma packed like the teenager she was, mostly clothes, her phone for photos, and snacks she'd grabbed from the kitchen at the last minute. The morning they left, Sarah kissed them both goodbye and made them promise to take plenty of pictures. She stood in the driveway waving as they drove away, excited for them to finally have the bonding experience they all knew they needed. She had no idea that she wouldn't see them smile genuinely for months afterward. The first day unfolded exactly as Marcus had hoped. The 8-mile hike to his secret clearing went smoothly. They set up camp with surprisingly good teamwork, and over dinner around the campfire, Emma actually seemed engaged in conversation for the first time in months. Marcus went to sleep that first night feeling optimistic about their relationship for the first time since he'd returned from overseas. He woke up in the middle of the night to sounds coming from outside their tent. Marcus listened carefully and heard what sounded like packages being opened and items being moved around. He figured it was just Emma who had gotten up to use the bathroom and went back to sleep. David woke up at dawn and noticed something strange. The cooler had been opened, and nearly half their food was gone. He immediately assumed Emma had gotten up in the middle of the night and raided it. "Emma," he said firmly, "did you eat this?" She looked confused. "No, Dad, I didn't touch it." David narrowed his eyes. "Emma, don't lie to me. Half the food is gone." But she kept insisting she hadn't eaten anything. Frustrated, David brushed it off. He figured maybe she just didn't want to admit it. This was exactly the kind of irresponsible behavior that had been creating tension between them at home. Small lies about insignificant things that somehow felt much larger in the context of their strained relationship. Marcus confronted Emma again about the missing food, explaining that they had limited supplies and needed to be honest with each other about consumption. Emma became defensive, insisting she hadn't taken anything and hadn't left the tent except to relieve herself on the other side of camp. The more she denied it, the more convinced Marcus became that she was lying. Their conversation escalated into an argument, with Marcus falling back into his military mindset about accountability and discipline, while Emma grew increasingly frustrated at being treated like a subordinate rather than his daughter. They spent the rest of the day hiking and exploring in uncomfortable silence, both feeling like the trip was already failing at its intended purpose. That second night, Marcus decided to stay partially awake to catch Emma in the act. He wanted to address her dishonesty directly, rather than let it continue to poison their relationship. He positioned himself in his sleeping bag so he could watch both Emma and the food supplies, pretending to be asleep while remaining alert. Around 2 a.m., he heard movement outside the tent again, but this time he could clearly see Emma sleeping peacefully in her sleeping bag right beside him. Marcus felt his blood chill as he realized that something else was moving around their campsite. Through the thin tent wall he could make out the shadow of something much larger than any typical forest animal circling their camp with slow, deliberate movements. The footsteps were the most unsettling part. They weren't the quick scampering of a raccoon or the heavy, lumbering gait of a bear. These were measured, careful steps that seemed almost thoughtful. as if whatever was out there was being deliberately quiet, trying not to wake them. He grabbed his flashlight, unzipped the flap, and shined it towards the cooler. It was open again. The food inside was scattered across the dirt. Before he could process what he was looking at, something moved just beyond the firelight. A massive shadowy figure slipped between the trees with inhuman speed. For the next hour, Marcus sat upright, hand on his hunting knife, listening. Branches snapped in the woods, heavy footsteps circled their camp, and every so often he swore he heard a low, guttural growl. Emma woke up. She whispered, "Dad, what is that?" Marcus didn't answer, because he didn't know. The thing was circling closer and closer. Marcus could hear their supplies being rifled through again with what sounded like hands rather than paws, items being carefully moved aside, packages being opened with precision. At one point he heard breathing outside the tent that was deep and rhythmic, but somehow wrong, too controlled, too aware. The creature spent nearly an hour in their camp before disappearing back into the forest, moving with surprising stealth for something so obviously large. When morning came, more food had vanished. This time it was their energy bars and a bag of dried fruit, again taken completely rather than torn apart or scattered like a typical animal encounter would leave behind. Marcus had to apologize to Emma, admitting that he'd been wrong to accuse her of lying. He explained what he'd witnessed during the night, and Emma's relief at being vindicated quickly transformed into fear as she realized something unknown had been circling their tent while they slept. They discussed leaving, but Marcus's military training made him reluctant to retreat from an unidentified threat, and Emma, despite her fear, didn't want to disappoint her father by cutting their bonding trip short. They decided to stay one more night, with Marcus keeping his knife and headlamp within easy reach. For their third night, Marcus created a simple early warning system using their spare rope and some empty cans from their supplies, setting up a perimeter around their campsite. If anything approached, the disturbance would wake them before it got too close. Marcus also briefed Emma on an emergency plan. If something happened, they would exit through the back of the tent away from any threat and make their way to a predetermined rally point between their camp and the trail back to the truck. At exactly 3:17 a.m. the cans began to rattle. Both Marcus and Emma jerked awake immediately. Through the tent wall they could see the silhouette of something massive moving just outside their camp. It stood at least 8 feet tall with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and it was moving with the same deliberate, intelligent gait Marcus had observed the night before. But this time the creature wasn't just taking their food, it was studying their camp. For nearly 10 minutes the thing circled their tent, stopping periodically as if examining different aspects of their setup. At one point it approached so close to the tent that Marcus could hear its breathing clearly, deep, controlled inhalations that sounded disturbingly human-like. Then the creature did something that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. It began making vocalizations, soft, guttural sounds that were clearly attempts to mimic human speech. The sounds were distorted and primitive but unmistakably deliberate, as if it was practicing, learning, preparing for some kind of communication. Marcus realized with growing horror that the creature had been listening to them talk during their previous days at camp. It was trying to replicate the sounds of their voices. At around 4 a.m. the noises suddenly stopped. The woods went completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping. Marcus again unzipped his tent to see if the creature had gone away, and then a face appeared in the glow of the dying fire. It was tall. Hair covered its entire body. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and its eyes were reflecting the firelight, glowing a dull, menacing amber. Marcus's blood ran cold. This was no bear. This was no man. It was Bigfoot. Marcus made the decision that probably saved both their lives. Rather than waiting to see what the creature wanted or trying to confront it, Marcus slowly reached for Emma's hand. They didn't pack up, they didn't grab their gear, they just ran. Branches snapped behind them as something massive gave chase. Marcus had been trained to stay calm under pressure, but this was primal terror. Using his military navigation training, Marcus guided them through the forest in near-complete darkness, moving as quickly and quietly as possible toward the trailhead where they'd left their truck. Behind them they could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. It seemed to have no trouble tracking them, and several times they heard those same guttural vocalizations echoing through the trees. The thing was still trying to mimic human speech as it followed them. The most terrifying moment came when they stopped to rest after about 4 miles. In the silence, they clearly heard what sounded like Emma's voice calling out from somewhere behind them in the darkness. But Emma was right there next to Marcus, and she hadn't made a sound. The creature had learned to perfectly imitate her voice. They didn't stop running again until they reached Marcus's truck at dawn, 6 hours after fleeing their campsite. The drive home was conducted in complete silence. Both Marcus and Emma were in a state of shock, trying to process what they'd experienced. When they arrived home that afternoon, Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. Both of them looked traumatized, and when she asked about their trip, they gave vague, evasive answers about cutting it short due to weather. For weeks, neither Marcus nor Emma spoke about what had happened in the woods. They couldn't find the words to describe it, and part of them wondered if anyone would believe them anyway. Sarah grew increasingly concerned as days passed, and both of them remained withdrawn and jumpy, especially after dark. Emma started having nightmares and would often wake up convinced she'd heard her own voice calling to her from outside her bedroom window. Marcus found himself obsessively checking locks and security systems, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching their house from the tree line behind their property. Their relationship had changed, but not in the way they'd hoped. Instead of bonding over shared outdoor experiences, they were now bonded by shared trauma, a secret so disturbing that they couldn't even discuss it with each other, let alone with Sarah. It wasn't until almost a month later that Marcus finally broke down and told Sarah everything. She listened in stunned silence as he described the 3 nights in the forest, and she immediately understood why both her husband and daughter had been so changed by the experience. Sarah convinced Marcus to do some research on similar encounters in the area. What he found made him wish he'd never looked. The Monongahela National Forest had a long history of Bigfoot sightings, with multiple reports dating back decades of encounters with large bipedal creatures that demonstrated unusual intelligence. Most disturbing were the accounts that mentioned the creature's ability to mimic human voices, a detail that appeared in report after report from different witnesses who had no contact with each other. Marcus discovered that their camping location was less than 5 miles from what local researchers called a hotspot for such encounters. 3 other families had reported similar experiences in the same general area over the past 10 years. Marcus never shared this information with Emma. He decided that some knowledge was more harmful than helpful, and that his daughter had been through enough. The family never went camping together again. In fact, they've never spent another night away from civilization as a group. When asked why, Sarah simply tells people that they prefer hotels now. But sometimes, late at night when the house settles and creaks, Marcus finds himself listening carefully to make sure the voices he hears calling softly from outside are just his imagination. Emma moved away for college the following year. She calls home regularly, but Marcus says there's always a moment of hesitation before she speaks, as if she's making sure her voice sounds like her own. The Chen family's campsite was never located by authorities because Marcus has never told anyone exactly where it was. He says some places in those ancient mountains are better left undisturbed, and sometimes, late at night when Sarah asks Marcus if he ever regrets not getting to complete their father-daughter bonding trip, he tells her the same thing every time. They bonded more in those 3 days than they ever could have under normal circumstances, just not in the way anyone would ever want. Alright guys, that's gonna do it for today's story. If you enjoyed it, please offer to hit that like button, and also subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys in the next one.